Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my 2015 fantasy baseball rankings for shortstops. And we're going to be doing something very different than what I've done for all the other positions I've done so far. We're actually going to look at another website, and I choose FNTSY, Fantasy Sports Network. These guys are pretty good, they're pretty reputable, and they give you 5 different opinions on each of these different guys and where they should be ranked. Now, why am I doing it like this? I'm doing it like this because shortstop, in my opinion, is one of the most difficult positions to rank because there's such a variety in players at shortstop, and there's just so many guys that are hit or miss guys. I feel like rather than have projections for you guys that are numbers that these guys could reach, I could just go through, talk about each guy, pros and cons of drafting him, and where I think they should be drafted. So without further ado, let's start it off with number 1, Troy Tulowitzki. Yes, Troy Tulowitzki, the consensus number 1, except for Kyle Sopp. But I think Troy Tulowitzki is a number 1 shortstop. I actually drafted him with my first round pick last season, and let me tell you, that was actually a pretty good move. Now, the thing with Troy Tulowitzki is that he's more than likely not going to play a full season. Now, you could get lucky with this, and he could come back right at the end of the season and give you that boost that you need, or it could be like last season where he misses about half the season. You never know with Troy Tulowitzki. You're going to get the number 1 shortstop if you draft Troy Tulowitzki, but you don't know how long you're going to have the number 1 shortstop for. That's the unfortunate thing about drafting Troy Tulowitzki. So if you draft Troy Tulowitzki, you're going to have to be satisfied getting one of these replacement level players who probably isn't going to be too good compared to some of the other names that you could have if you hadn't drafted Troy Tulowitzki. So for me, Troy Tulowitzki is a late first round option in a roto league, but in head-to-head points, he probably falls to the end of the second, maybe beginning of the third round, just because you're going to need him for the end of the season more in a points league than you will in a roto league. With a roto league, you can just combine him with a replacement level player, and that'll be fine, but in a points league, you need him scoring points at the end of the season. Number 2, which I actually do agree with, is Ian Desmond. Shortstop for the Nationals, 20-homer guy, hits for some average. He plays in a very good lineup. I think he should consensus be the number 2 pick. There's not a ton of downside when talking about Ian Desmond, except for the fact that maybe his floor is a little bit lower than a lot of these guys on the list. But there's no significant injury risk when taking Ian Desmond, and he plays in a pretty good lineup, so he should be able to score some runs, drive in some runs. So I think Ian Desmond is a very smart choice if you can get him for a good price. In a roto league and a points league, he should probably be going in around the same place. I don't have ADPs or anything, so I can't talk about like ADPs for anyone except Troy Tulowitzki. Now, Hanley Ramirez is pretty much the consensus guy for number 2, and I would agree with that. Hanley Ramirez is moving to Boston as a right-handed hitter. That's a little bit better for him because you do have the shorter but higher porch in left field in the Green Monster, and he's also going to be playing the outfield, which means he's probably not going to be hurt as much. And let's say Troy Tulowitzki played the outfield, he'd probably be a lot more valuable at shortstop too because there is significantly less injury risk in the outfield, and you've got a guy who in Hanley Ramirez is a very big injury risk, and putting him in the outfield where he's probably not going to be hurt too often is a good move for me. But last season he did have kind of a bad season compared to what he's had before, and he is nearing that 30-something plateau. And you never know what's going to happen with Hanley Ramirez. He could be injured, he could underperform. You don't know, there's always risk when taking Hanley Ramirez. Now, number 4, which I agree being number 4, Jose Reyes. As always, Jose Reyes is an injury risk each and every season, but as you saw last season, he might not be injured for most of the season or really at all, and when he's not injured, he produces a lot. He steals a lot of bases, he hits for a good average, he's going to get driven in a shit ton in that Toronto lineup, so as long as he can stay healthy and get on base, Jose Reyes could very well be the number 1 shortstop in all of fantasy, provided that Troy Tulowitzki goes down with an injury, Hanley Ramirez goes down with an injury, and depending on how well Jose Reyes does, he could be the number 1 guy in fantasy. You never know, though. He could also be injured. So those top 4 guys are really the most wishy-washy of all the kind of different tiers of shortstop there are. Now we go to number 5, Jimmy Rollins, who I don't really agree with being number 5. I feel like Jimmy Rollins should be significantly lower on the list. While he is pretty consistent and a pretty decent hitter. Jimmy Rollins just doesn't have that excitement factor. He doesn't make you excited to put him on your team. He's not a guy he's not a guy with a high ceiling, but he's a guy with a very high floor. So the worst Jimmy Rollins season is probably going to be better than the best, let's say, Asdrubal Cabrera season. He's a guy that has a really kind of a low ceiling, but a very high floor. So if you're looking for a safety guy at shortstop, Jimmy Rollins is probably your guy. Now we go to Ben Zobrist, who for some of these guys is ranked very low and not even ranked. And I would agree with that. Jimmy Rollins was a huge letdown last season, and he just didn't perform well. And now he moves to Oakland, the Coliseum, where the fences are further out. He's older. He doesn't have a fantastic lineup there in Oakland. And I just don't see anything really going right for Ben Zobrist this season, because things just don't line up for Ben Zobrist for me. So I don't think Ben Zobrist is going to be that great of a guy. I think he should be down in probably the 20s, because he's a guy that's going to play every day and do decent, but he's not a great player anymore. He's not a great fantasy value anymore. Now we go to Starlin Castro, who I believe should be in that 5 spot where Jimmy Rollins is. Starlin Castro is a guy who had a bounce-back year last year. He didn't do well in 2013. I don't remember if 2012 was a disappointment. I think he did really well in 2012. That was the year where he had like 200-something hits, and that's not who he is. He had an insane BABIP year. He's not a career He's not going to be a 300 hitter, but that 280 hitter that we saw him as last year, he's probably going to be a 280 hitter. I completely agree with that. He is a decent hitter. He can make a lot of contact. He reminds me a little bit of Vladimir Guerrero, because he'll swing a lot of things, but he'll hit a lot of things. He'll put a lot of things in play. I once saw him hit a curveball that bounced out like 2 feet in front of the plate and get a single on it. He's a guy that can make solid contact. He's also a guy who the power numbers have been increasing each and every year. He's been hitting more and more and more home runs. He's entering his age 25 season. He's still entering his prime, guys. He's been in the league for years, so he's still entering his prime. He's a guy that could definitely have a huge year. And Starlin Castro, I think he's a solid number 5 guy. And now we go to J.J. Hardy, who a lot of the consensus rankings have a lot lower than this, and I completely agree. He had almost no power through the first half of last season, and that's really concerning for a guy. When he has no power one half of the season and power the other half of the season, that's kind of reminiscent of Gene Segura in 2013. Gene Segura had just this insane power stretch, but then hit no power for the second half of the season, I think. It was pretty weird, but J.J. Hardy, he's another guy that's kind of got like a low ceiling, but a high floor. He's kind of a safety pick, but some guy you're not going to be really too excited to get. So, J.J. Hardy, he belongs somewhere in about the 15s, I think. Now we go to a guy, Javier Baez, who has shortstop and second base eligibility, and he presents a very odd conundrum. Javier Baez is a guy that I firmly believe will not be in the majors at some point this season. I firmly believe that he will be in the minor leagues at some point this season. But with that being said, he's probably one of the most high upside shortstops you can get outside of those top 4. He's a guy that could hit 30 to 40 home runs, but he's also a guy that's going to hit for probably less than a 200 average. You're really going to have to weigh the risks when playing with Javier Baez in a points league where strikeouts are minus half a point or minus a point. He's really dangerous. He's a guy that strikes out just about every other at bat and doesn't make a ton of contact, but he's a guy that's going to hit a ton of home runs. So you have to really decide what is going to outweigh what there. And in a roto league where strikeouts don't really matter and his home run production does, that makes him very valuable. If you have a shortstop that can hit this many home runs, that frees you up to, say, get a third baseman or a first baseman who just hits for average. That allows you to go out and get a Matt Carpenter at third base as opposed to having to go out and get like a Todd Frazier. That's 40 home runs from a shortstop position or 30 home runs from a shortstop position that you wouldn't have to get from a third base position. That allows you to go get a guy who's specialized in average or specializes in average and speed to kind of counterbalance that out. And that could be a very interesting roto strategy this year, but I firmly believe that at some point, his lack of hitting, whether it's right out of spring training or middle of the season, he's going to get sent down to the minors at some point to work on his mechanics. Now we go with Alexei Ramirez, another guy that's got kind of a high ceiling but a really low floor, a good safety pick. He was great last year. He was really hot. Age just doesn't seem to be affecting Alexei Ramirez. He's a guy that every year, perennial fantasy beast. I think he's probably worth a top 10 pick. And yeah, I don't really want to spend too much more time talking about him. He's a decent pick. Now, Gene Segura, a guy who had an awful 2014 season. The speed wasn't there, the power wasn't there, the average wasn't there, but you know what? Things have to change. The BABIP is going to increase for Gene Segura. He's not going to have those crazy power numbers he had in 2013, but he does have the speed. He does have the ability to get on base. He should be a lot higher than he was last season in the rankings, and he could be the first legitimate sleeper on this list, in my firm opinion. He's a guy that's going to get you a lot of steals, but the on-base average, or the batting average, could be kind of wishy-washy. He's another guy, that has a low floor but a really high ceiling. Xander Bogaerts, almost the exact same thing. You don't know where Xander Bogaerts is going to go. He didn't do fantastic last season. He hasn't really been fantastic in his career like they thought he was going to be, so Xander Bogaerts is a guy that I'm probably not going to be targeting in draft. Now, Eric Ibar, who's probably the definition of safety at the shortstop position, perennially great in fantasy baseball. He was very good last year, and another guy that's kind of a low ceiling but high floor, late round pick that you might want to take. Alcides Escobar, he carried my team for like 2 months after Troy Tulowitzki went out. He's a guy that steals bases. He can hit for average at times in the season, but he's not going to hit for an overall fantastic average. He hits probably around 260, 270 this season, I say, and that's not bad. That's just about league average for winning a fantasy baseball league. League average is about 250, and he's above that. He's an above-average hitter who can steal bases. He's definitely kind of a value pick down here, but he's also a guy that has a very low floor. High ceiling, low floor player again. Now, Jung Ho Kang. Very interesting name. International player. No major league experience. I don't know what's going to happen. Don't ask me for any advice on Jung Ho Kang. It looks like he's mainly going to be a utility player, so you might want to draft him. He may wind up being the Ben Zobrist of this year, where he's got position eligibility all over the place, and he can be really good. Maybe Ben Zobrist wasn't the best option, but he might be like the James Harrison of this year for the Pirates, where he hits insanely well, and they just have to pencil him in somewhere each and every day. Now, Elvis Anders, a guy who had a terrible 2014 season, but everyone was hurt down in Houston, or just Texas, in Arlington, Texas, so he's a guy that I expect a bounce-back season from. He's probably going to be like a top 8 player. Most definitely. He's got speed, he's got average, he doesn't really hit for power, but he's going to get driven in a lot, because I feel like there's no way that Texas lineup could get any worse, I don't think, than it was last season. Now, coming to about the last 2 or 3 guys that I feel are fantasy relevant for this season, Johnny Peralta, Johonny, Jahony Peralta, however you want to say it. Guy played for the Cardinals last year, wasn't spectacular, kind of a low ceiling, low floor guy. I don't know if I really want to draft him. Chris Owings was insanely good before he got injured last year, and he does play at a favorable ballpark down there at Citi Field. No, not Citi Field. Chase Field. And you just got to question the lineup around him. I don't know if the lineup around him is going to be spectacular. I don't know if he's going to have that same production that he had last season. So Chris Owings is kind of like a high ceiling but really, really low floor guy. And then Jed Lowry, who's always good for like 1 or 2 months of good production. You might want to pair him with Troy Tulowitzki. That could definitely have a huge impact on your fantasy team. But Jed Lowry is another one. You can always count on him to have a good like month or 2 of the season and then just do nothing from there on out. He's not a great fantasy player, but he's good in bursts. And then honorable mentions down here, don't draft Everett Cabrera. He's not even signed to a team. Danny Santana had that insane BABIP last season, so don't expect him to be hitting like 320, 340 again this season. It's just not going to happen. Addison Russell may be fantasy relevant at some point this season, as will Jonathan VR, and possibly Didi Gregorius. These 3 are probably your deepest sleepers. They might wind up doing something. Didi Gregorius almost has an everyday position. I'm not really sure. But these are guys that could have an everyday presence and could be very good for you, but they're also guys that might not even break the Major League roster this year. These 2 in particular, not really so much Didi Gregorius, but if you're looking for like an insanely deep sleeper, if you can't draft anyone on this list, Francisco Linder probably has the next best chance of making the Major Leagues. He's probably going to hit somewhat, probably in like the 240s. Maybe some speed. I don't really know. I don't really have a full scouting report on him, but that's kind of my fantasy baseball rankings, guys. I know I didn't really do these rankings, but I felt this was the best way I could do this, so I want to thank you guys for watching. If you did enjoy, don't forget to click that like button, And I want to thank you guys for watching once again, and I will see you guys later.